welcome everyone for our attending this patient leader webinar tonight. We are super excited. We have Havas's Health Director of Medical Anthropology, Brad Davidson, with us tonight. He previously presented this webinar at South by Southwest, so this is really exciting content and definitely beneficial for everyone in the community, whether you're a community leader and you're looking how to improve your community, or maybe you're just in a Facebook group and you really want to foster that community feel and, how can you improve that? So Brad's going to be taking a deeper look into the communities, online health communities, and really looking at, the insights and analysis that we can pull from that to see the interactions between our members and to see the experiences they're facing. So again, if you guys have questions throughout the presentation, or maybe you have comments, utilize that chat box. At the end of the presentation, we'll open up for a few moments of Q&A. So if you have questions in between, feel free to leave it in the chat, but if you want to ask it at the end too, we do have time for that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Brad.
Okay, so hi, thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm Brad. I'm actually going to put slides up in a minute, but I was told that it's nice to put a face to a name and a voice when you start, so this is me. And I'm going to get started in just 2 seconds as soon as I can figure out how to get my PowerPoint slides up. It's face to the name. Nice to meet all of you virtually. Before I jump in, I just want to piggyback on something that was said in the introduction. So this is a presentation that I've given before. It is a modification of that. I've updated it, but in the spirit of what I gave before, this is really about looking at online healthcare communities from the lens of an anthropologist, which is the lens that I bring to it, because a lot of the analyses that I've seen of online healthcare communities and that I've seen over the years really don't apply that lens very rigorously. It's not a bad thing, just people come from different backgrounds and they're looking in different ways at different sort of forms of content. But so my background as a linguist and an anthropologist, I've always studied doctor-patient interactions. I've done things like did a postdoctoral fellowship on communication and end-of-life care, where I spent a year at a lung clinic out in California studying how doctors were trained to talk to patients about end-of-life decision-making. And so a lot of that was really focused on the sort of traditional anthropologic analyses of things like, how do people define communities? How do people participate in communities? How do people join communities? How do people find communities? And in that case, it was really a community of residents and fellows, people going through the same training experience. And so hopefully this is good food for thought. I like to think of it as a start of a discussion. I don't really belong to any online healthcare communities. I study them. So would love anybody's feedback, and I'll just jump right in then. So there's 4 sections and then a Q&A. So first is just anthropology and the internet, and then talking about online community structure, what it is, what does it mean. I haven't seen a lot of those analyses. And then really looking at online healthcare communities of practice, what they do and what roles they play, and what we can learn from them. And then also just what we can learn from applying anthropological models to online interactions. So without further ado, I will jump in. So since the very beginning, internet really enabled health-focused communities. I think you all know this, but I mean, this back in the Usenet days, before there was anything, back before AOL even launched, people were finding each other online. It had a lot to do with need. So in the early days, it was what we called non-co-located forums. If you had a rare genetic disorder, if you were somebody who had a hard time leaving the house or lived remotely, had very few options. So people with certain end-stage cancers, if you had a disease that people told you wasn't really a disease, or you couldn't get very much satisfaction from the traditional medical establishment that you were visiting, people went online very quickly to find each other and talk. And so the thing about online communities is that this was true of people who also collected 58 Chevys. I mean, that was really what drove the internet adoption in some ways, was sort of very focused use groups. And you could find use groups around Dungeons and Dragons, and you could find them around shoes. But the reason healthcare communities are different is because health is different. So health-focused communities deal more with the sort of bottom of Maslow's hierarchy there, which is the physiological needs. The people who are talking about how to be a better dungeon master or how to collect whatever it is people collect, they're really focusing more on this sort of self-actualization aspect of it, which is awesome. It's great. It makes life very powerful and wonderful, but it's very different when you have a community of parents talking to each other about what do I do for my child who is facing a life-threatening illness. They have a different set of needs and really a different sort of emotional tenor. And so one of the things you learn is that, and this is just from the Pew Internet and American Life Project, it's a little dated now, but it is an interesting snapshot in time. When other demographic factors are held constant, having a chronic disease significantly increases an internet user's likelihood to say they work on a blog or contribute to an online discussion, a listserv, or other online group forum that helps people with personal issues or health problems. So what's interesting is pretty much everybody goes on the internet these days. It's how you go on the internet. And at least back 7 years ago, which might as well be 70 million years ago at this point, but you were less likely to go on the internet if you had a chronic disease, but if you went on, you were much, much, much more likely to engage deeply with peers. And I think that's really the key point about this. And I don't think that has changed. And so since not only does the internet allow you to connect with people, people are also, there's a push and a pull. We've entered a new era of healthcare. There's a lot more information available to patients than there was a generation ago or even 5 years ago. There's a lot more self-management, some of it by design, some of it not by design. It's getting harder and harder to see doctors. The waits are longer. They give you less advice. So I'm just checking to see the chat, right? It keeps flashing at me. So, all right, good. So I was hoping there was no problem, right? And also medical practice is really moving from what I think of as a relation-based to a transactional sort of model. Now, that's not true for chronic diseases. People do get to know their doctors, but in general, people don't have the relationships of many years or decades that they had with, say, their primary care physician that they had once upon a time. So it's getting harder and harder for primary care doctors to be able to recognize, for example, if a patient is acting strangely because they don't know the patient at all. And so people are really both being pushed online by what has become a less personal healthcare system, but also attracted to each other. I mean, in the same way that we are attracted to people who talk about things that we're interested in about in other spaces. In the healthcare space, talking to people who are walking in your shoes is very appealing. So let's see, there we go. So I think I just made that point. I don't want to belabor this too much. So what we're going to discuss is really what are these communities, what we can call them, and what we can learn from them. Just a bit of grounding. All right, so what do we mean by online community? This really gets to the meat of the talk now. Because the word community gets thrown around a lot, and sometimes we're talking about communities, and sometimes we're talking about maybe something that's not technically what I would call a community. It just depends on the level of relationship. So what do we know and what can we learn about online health-related communities? So this is a woman, Heidi Hamilton. She's now the chair of the Department of Linguistics at Georgetown, but at the time she wrote this, she was just starting out as a professor. And as a member of several active discussion lists, I have found it hard to avoid making comparisons between those cyber communities and other communities of which I'm a member. I have wondered, for example, if such communities act like face-to-face communities in socializing new members, and whether, and if so, how, language choices made by long-term members of the community work to accomplish this goal. Now, Heidi is very open. Her child had a very bad bone marrow disorder, and she's one of the people who went on listservs and created a community, and it's still together today. So in the early 90s, her child was sick. It's 2017, and she still talks to those people on a fairly regular basis. So they really did create a community, a very small, tight-knit community, and her interest was, what are the language norms? How do we talk to each other? Which makes sense. She's a linguist. But that question sort of piqued my interest as well. And so I decided to apply some old school anthropology to some of these communities and say, all right, well, if we just pretend that this is a community that we've stumbled across somewhere, not on the internet, but in the middle of a jungle somewhere, how would we approach it? And we would look at things like kinship terminology and norms of interaction, what's considered normal and what's not. How do you join? How do you know when you've become a member? Are there spaces involved? So things like private spaces to use the bathroom. Well, obviously not on the internet, but there are private spaces where people talk to each other. There are public discussions and there are private ones. What are the rituals? What are the named events? And so, trying to apply this wholesale to communities that exist in cyberspace doesn't always work, but to the degree that it does, it's very interesting analogy. So first, just sort of what are we looking at, right? The naming is everywhere. People talk about net ethnographies, digital ethnographies, virtual anthropology, cyber anthropology. The communities themselves have a lot of different names, and this sort of emic edict thing just means like, what do we call ourselves? Now, I know there's the what is it? The online diabetes community, but it's the DCO, the diabetes community online is what it calls itself. But there used to be user groups, there used to be news groups, there's virtual communities, there's disease-specific patient networks. What does the community call itself is of most interest to an anthropologist. And like I said, it's the diabetes community online. To me, that's an interesting name. But let's take a look at a different one. Let's take a look at the Diabetes Hub. This is just a sampling from 5 years ago. There was 3,700 posts, 400 distinct users. There were no average users. The top user wrote 296 posts. A lot of people only posted once, and in the middle, a lot of people posted about 10 times. That's about right for how much people work in this space. Some people are very casual, some people are very committed. You find this across the board, but it's very hard to find a community in this, right? This is the network of people talking to each other. And as you look at it, you say, this is a fairly loosely connected small world network. And one thing you find from anthropology is that small world networks sound interesting, but actually aren't very meaningful. So for example, I went to the same high school that Matt Damon did at the same time. Technically, everybody on this phone is now 2 degrees away from Matt Damon. It's kind of meaningless. I don't know the guy, right? So the fact that you're on the same internet space at the same time doesn't mean you're really interacting with each other. There's some central users and there's a lot of peripheral ones. There's some overlapping areas of dense connections, but it's very hard to parse this. However, if you apply certain modeling software, you start to see that within that large network, there really are communities of people. And the first really interesting finding, now I worked with a statistician and a computational linguist who's a friend of mine to do this modeling. The first thing we noticed is these communities within the community tend to form at about 50 to 120 people, which is about the size of pretty much every organizational structure in human activity that is the smallest functional structure. So platoons are about that size, villages are about that size. About 150 to 120 people is about how many people you can get to know well without getting too big and without being so small that the group sort of suffers catastrophically when people leave. So it seems that pretty common in the Diabetes Hub, it's about 100 members. They're likely to have links with each other, but they're less likely to be linked to people outside the cluster. So again, just going from, so if I can do this, from this, which is a huge network, and often this would be called some kind of community online, to this, where we really start to see the communities themselves coalescing. So the question then becomes, so these are clearly looking like communities, small groups of tightly interconnected people. If you take a look at the pink circle in the upper left, all of those people are connected to each other pretty densely, meaning they all know each other. So imagine a church group, right? Everybody knows everybody. It's virtually the same thing, it's just it's happening online. So then the question is, well, what kind of community is it? And the interesting analogy was, is it a community of practice? Now, I didn't really introduce that concept, and I'll save it for later, so let's move forward. But a community of practice is a very specific thing in the social science literature. So we're analyzing these communities by analogy, and these aren't really primitive cultures per se, and that's kind of an insulting term, but primitive technically means something a little bit different, right? They're very similar to small communities in that they're bounded in space and time. We have to find the boundaries, right? So we had to look to see, well, where do people collect? They're small. They have a shared culture and language. They're very different, though. So if you were living in a remote island somewhere and Margaret Mead came upon you, you wouldn't be able to leave that island. What's interesting about the online communities is people are only really together when they're online. A lot of times people are incredibly remote physically. There might be 5,000, there might be 10,000 miles away. Heidi Hamilton had people in her network in New Zealand. So it is a virtual space. And the other thing that's interesting is they tend to emerge and collapse spontaneously. So Heidi studied a lot of these bone marrow communities, and they would emerge around say a strong user, and then they would disappear. Not all of them last for 25 years. And they're also very thematically focused. They tend to be focused on one major issue. That makes sense. I think that's fairly intuitive. So not so much we all share this island, and so everything we do we share, but it's really about a shared belief or experience around being a spinal cord injury patient, having diabetes, having a child with a bad bone marrow disorder. And so those sort of monothematic, or at least initially monothematic communities lend themselves to analysis that leads to what's called a community of practice. We don't mean primitive as unsophisticated, though. That was something that we wanted to get across really, really clearly right from the start. So when we call these communities primitive, it doesn't mean stupid or backwards or anything else. It means very specifically not structured. So there's no mayor of any of these. There's no governing body of these communities. There's no legislature of these communities. They simply form spontaneously, create their own norms. They're very densely connected, and they don't really have institutional support necessarily. So you can't appeal to a judge, for example. Now, in a lot of youth groups, you can appeal to somebody and say, hey, I'm being bullied or abused. But far more often, the norms are simply agreed upon by the community in a very organic way. So this group, now this is easier to pull off when I can actually see people's faces, but this is not an online healthcare community. This is a network of baseball steroid users. So this was mapped out by a sociologist looking at the Barry Bonds group, as it were. And what was interesting at that time was, and this is, I promise this is relevant to the discussion, there was a guy who was accused of sort of being the ringleader of all of this. And he was a trainer. And basically everybody tried to throw him under the bus, saying he led all these poor baseball players astray. And the sociologist said that's not even marginally credible, that these $1 million baseball players did not get led down this horrible path by some guy they barely knew. It was each other. So he mapped out how they knew each other. And basically everybody who was implicated in this major steroids report had played with each other on a team at some point. And that's where they got to know each other. And what they were doing was learning from each other how to become better. Let's just see. Okay, sorry. I'm trying to figure out how not to have the chat show up, right? So what was interesting is it's basically professional baseball players in this case, learning from each other how to be better baseball players, in their mind better. Hey, how do you hit 70 home runs in a year? Take this stuff. And so the fact that they threw some guy under the bus who was neither a professional baseball player nor a baseball player at all was really disingenuous. They learned from each other. But the key thing about this, there's three key things to take away from this slide. One is baseball steroid users all knew each other. This didn't happen spontaneously. They showed each other how to do this stuff. Two is they did it because they were trying to help each other get better, right? Nobody did this to try and keep each other out of the Hall of Fame, although that's what's happening now. At the time, they were trying to help each other get better. And three is this sort of happened organically. There was no cabal, there was no meeting somewhere where somebody said, let's create a network of users who all take steroids. It just happened, and they all just happened to know each other. So what did you have? You had a couple of ingredients. You had a group of people who were interested in the same thing, getting better at baseball. They were all already baseball players. They all kind of knew each other, and they got to know each other better by working together to get better at hitting a baseball much, much, much further. Now, it turns out this is also the network of people who may never get into the Hall of Fame because they were all discovered. But that is what a community of practice is by definition. So, oops, that's not how I forward, right? So a community of practice, we will now switch over and I will talk a little bit about what that means, right? So online healthcare communities of practice. This was a big aha for my partner, a guy named Rob Malouf, right? So communities of practice originally was something by Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger to explain what they called situated learning. Communities of practice are groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. That's a pretty bland, pretty tofu statement. They made it in the context of learning, in the context of apprenticeships. They were very interested in the sociology of education, and they wanted to know, is there a way of having a learning curriculum, an approach, a philosophy where no one fails? And it turns out there is. People don't fail their apprenticeships. Some people take longer than others to become a tailor, but if you become an apprentice tailor, the assumption is you will be a tailor someday. And unless you actually leave the apprenticeship program, there's no getting an F in being a tailor. It just takes you longer. And so they came up with this idea of community of practice, which was around people getting better at doing something together that they're all interested in doing, both individually and collectively, they get better. And when my friend Rob, who is not an anthropologist, we both came out of the same linguistics department, but he's a computational linguist. I said to him, these look like communities of practice, but that doesn't make sense because nobody's getting paid. They're not professionals. I was thinking of this as an apprenticeship thing, and Rob, in his sort of classically cut to the chase way, went, but they are professionalizing. They're really becoming better at being patients. And that was like the turning point for us. And we said, these are really communities, and they're communities of practice, and they're focused around getting better at being a patient or being a caregiver. And so the three crucial components of a community of practice are, it's a domain. So you have a shared domain, provides common ground for discussion. So if you all have a child who has a bad bone marrow disease, there's a community, so social relations build trust and facilitate learning. There's mutual engagement. Again, if you think of those smaller circles within the big circle, a board with 4,700 members is a whole lot of strangers. It's hard to get to know 4,700 people online, but it's not hard to get to know 50 or 100 people if you're interacting with them collectively all the time. And then a shared community that's constructed around knowledge of a profession. Now that was what threw me initially, because I was thinking of profession as something you get paid to do. But when we sort of turned it around and said, what's really happening is, in an era when patients are being asked to take care of themselves and want to take care of themselves, there really is a professionalizing class of patients, and they are becoming better at being patients or caregivers in some cases, and I'll show that. So not all communities are communities of practice. A community of practice is distinct from a community of interest, right? In order to be a member, you have to be actively participating in the profession. It's self-selecting, it's self-educating, it's self-monitoring. Profession can be interpreted broadly. This is more about, we don't just mean like white-collar professions. Gang members are communities of practice. Self-selecting, self-educating, self-monitoring. If this is starting to sound familiar to some of the communities that you belong online, right? Self-monitoring. Somebody steps out of line, who do you turn to? You turn to each other. And you say, you either need to get straight or get gone, right? That's exactly how gangs work as well, by the way. So when you start thinking about these small groups of individuals who have, maybe there's bylaws, but it's not like the United States Constitution that it's written somewhere. Think of these as communities of practice. Not all professions are communities of practice, right? So librarians, there can be librarian conferences, but they don't necessarily talk to each other every day about how to be a better librarian. Bartenders, high school students, they share a domain and a practice, but they don't have regular social interaction. So just because I went to high school with Matt Damon does not make him and me in the same community of practice. Him and Ben Affleck were in the same community of practice because they were actors, and they all engaged with becoming better actors and went on to be very famous as a result. But I only was in the same place with them at the same time. I didn't really interact with them. So if you share a health issue, you don't automatically constitute a community of practice. So all 4,700 people in the diabetes hub are not members of the same community of practice. But a lot of these online healthcare forums host self-organizing groups of participants who do form COPs, right? So we looked at 3 of them. We looked at a type 2 diabetes group, an Alzheimer's caregiver, hexa mutation carriers. All of these exhibited exactly what we thought they would once we started looking at it from this perspective. These were groups of people who were trying to get better, smarter at being patients or being informed about their choices, which is really about being a better patient, through collective effort. Sustained mutual interaction. They communicate via news group, forum postings, chat, like any way they can. Sometimes they'll meet offline. They establish and maintain relationships. Heidi Hamilton has relationships going on close to 30 years now with some of these people that go well beyond the health issues of their children. So now they've really become more social communities. But they share specialized knowledge and skills about things like managing symptoms, evaluating treatment options, navigating the healthcare system, just getting through the night, just supporting each other. All of it is both mutual support, which I think is well known and well documented, but it's also how do you get better at mutually supporting each other? It's this notion of we're getting better at doing the thing that we want to do together or need to get better at doing through interacting with each other. And that to me was a fascinating insight. So again, before I move on, normally I would say like any questions, but webinars are a little weird, so I can't do that. But this would be a good spot for questions. But I will say I'm going to move on now and say, so what other sort of tools? So once you figure out, okay, I can find communities that aren't just large groups of people sort of leaving questions that get 42 responses from strangers. That's a valuable thing, but that's not a community necessarily. But what else, now that I've been able to identify things that qualify by certain definitional criteria as actual communities, what else can I apply to them from the anthropology sort of canon? All right, well, one of them is joining a community has some explicit socialization to it. A lot of communities, when you go in, they will give you the rules, right? So this is about a spinal cord injury community. Right? This forum is not for wannabes, pretenders, devotees, or those people with a fetish for wheelchair users, as such members of society may perceive as being insensitive by those with spinal cord injuries. If you are identified as such, your membership will be terminated without warning and your post removed, blah, 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 right? So basically, this is an explicit social charter. They're telling you what you can and cannot do. And clearly, from the nature of it, this is something that they've had problems with before. Now, all communities have explicit socialization. You know, you must wash your hands after using the bathroom, that sort of thing. But implicit socialization is probably more powerful and more difficult to identify for just because it happens so easily. But so I'll do a little dramatic reading. I think you've probably gotten ahead of it, right? But the local sequential function that a specific narrative fulfills may often be the sharing of information or experience with other members of the community. Basically, stories are to tell people what happened to you, right? But if this information is conveyed by means of a narrative complete with reported speech, the language used may contribute significantly to the global function to help socialize readers of that posting into a survivor identity. I'm going to put that into English, right? Because this is really academese. What Heidi is saying here is the way people tell stories help show other community members how to tell a survivor story. And what Heidi goes on to say in this article is that if you don't get with that program, if you tell stories that are essentially a downer or refuse to take on this survivor identity, you are essentially frozen out of the community. Nobody throws you out, but they stop responding to your posts. And it has a lot to do with the way that this particular community she was a member of was formed around some pretty desperate times. These were young children, they had very poor prognoses, and the community just didn't want to engage in negativity. And what Heidi found was that the way that they socialized new members joining the community was both welcome, but then also a lot of modeling, as you would do for any new member in a community. to say, this is kind of how we do things. And if you step over the lines, we'll kind of gently show you the error of your ways by, not by calling you out, but by, again, showing you the right way to do it. And if you don't want to get with that program, then you get gone. That is absolutely how communities work in the real world space. You can imagine in high school, small cliques sort of forming and people not quite getting with it. And then they just never end up catching on with that group. All right. And then there's levels of membership. So again, this notion of community of practice, one of the things that they identified that was successful in this learning model was that there was a period of time where they called licensed peripheral participation. Now remember, they were writing this in the 70s before lurking online was a thing, because there was no online. Licensed peripheral participation is what children do when they get to a playground and they stand at the edge and they watch the game for a while, and once they feel comfortable that they understand the basic rules of the game, they jump in and they start playing. One of the ways you can identify children who may or may not have ADHD, but who certainly might have some social issues, is they don't wait. They just show up at a playground and they jump in and they start trying to play the game before they figured out the rules. That's very disruptive. So this notion of licensed peripheral participation, in order for a community to be a true community of practice, there has to be a way of joining it by first watching it, understanding it, and then leaping in. That's exactly how the internet works. And some communities talk about designations that will call you a lurker or a newbie or a member. And this, I think, came from the, this is from the spinal cord injury community, where they basically gave you rankings, but even if they didn't, these would hold. If you're somebody who's just watching and not really posting, and by the way, they didn't say being a lurker is bad. They just said, these are how we sort of, when you see somebody and it says they're a member, it means that they've posted this many times, right? What are some of the other explicit norms of communication? Well, for one is you orient people to who you are and why you're at the board. This seems like so obvious to people who participate in online healthcare communities, but if you don't participate in them, it's sort of invisible. Hello, everyone. I'm new to the board, right? So first, who am I and where am I? So I'm telling you, I might not know the rules, so be a little gentle on me. And then the second thing is, I'm not diabetic as far as I know, right? So again, here's my relationship to the diabetes community. However, I do have a question related to diabetes, blah, blah, blah. And so basically this person was told, you don't seem to have diabetes by the community. And they said, thank you for showing up, but I'm not so sure you need to be here. But that orientation happens all the time. Every new member posting or every new thread comes with some sort of orientation. And so what can we learn then from being able to apply some of these, things like kinship terminologies, things like, joining rituals, things like explicit socialization? Well, we can learn a lot of things, right? For one, culture matters. In a general way, observing the evolving role of peer-to-peer healthcare interaction as healthcare delivery evolves it is something that's incredibly important for people in my line of work. So again, I work for Havas Health. We create a lot of support tools. We create a lot of educational materials. We create a lot of the booth materials at conferences and things like that. If we were to do so without an understanding of the role that patients are playing in their own healthcare, we'd sort of be designing tools for the 50s, basically. But also, just in terms of thinking about, can we really solve problems if we don't understand the nature of them? And by problems, I mean, well, really almost anything in healthcare, anything from access to stress to caregiver burnout. So one of the things, I keep mentioning caregivers, Alzheimer's caregivers are under a tremendous amount of stress. And one of the things that the Alzheimer's caregivers communities turns out to do is a lot of, here's how I did this, how did you do it? And I'll show you one of those in a minute. But certainly if you were to try and help the Alzheimer's patient community, one place to start would be by helping the Alzheimer's caregiver community, because they're under a tremendous amount of pressure. So, so here's one, right? So, actually, let me go back. Well, Unfortunately, it's a WebEx, right? But at this point, I would ask normally, so what does the talk mean? If I said I gave the talk to my 16-year-old, the answer usually comes back, people recognize that it's the birds and the bees. That's the talk. The fact that there's a named speech event called the talk that you have with your children means that we all have this same sort of cultural notion of a thing, right? We share community in that way. Well, if you're in the Alzheimer's community, the talk is, how do I get the keys from my parents so that they can't drive anymore? And I usually show this one because it sort of ups the ante. How do I get the keys and the guns from my my husband, right? So last week, the doctor plans to tell my husband he can no longer drive. He was an on-the-road salesman nearly all his adult life. To him, driving is second nature. So he thinks, how am I going to enforce this? And oh, by the way, he's armed to the teeth. It sort of goes on. What's interesting is she got 42 responses within 2 days from people she knew, and they all were saying, here's what I tried that worked, here's what I tried that didn't. This is exactly how a community of practice works. I have a problem, I want to get better at it, and that thing is I need to get the keys from my husband. Can you help me get better at it? And everybody collectively pitches in with what worked and what didn't. And so individually and collectively, they're getting better at learning how to be Alzheimer's caregivers. This was one that in the spinal cord injury community turns out loomed pretty large. If anybody on the line is from the spinal cord community, if I'm wrong about this, please feel free to correct me, but this is what we discerned. Again, named events. The most critical, not the most, but a critical step towards living a more balanced life when you have a traumatic spinal cord injury is the first time you go out socially in a wheelchair. That was considered to be an enormous step if you could bring yourself to do that. And there was a lot of postings about that, and they all sort of followed the same pattern, which was, it felt like it was time for me to do this. So I did it. Here's what it was like. I'm really, really glad. It was kind of awkward and horrible, but I had to do it, and I thought I'd share. What is the function of a narrative like that, of a story like that? Anthropologists tend to overread things a little bit, but I would say one of the functions is to simply model for everyone else. This is how you can go about getting your life back in order. This is how you can go back to going out with your mates at Christmas, because that's what you want to do. So it's not just about posting it for yourself, it's about posting it for the community. And that sense is really strong when you read enough of these. So, and then when you think about joining, and I realize time is maybe getting a little bit tight, so I'm going to do this one quickly, but often analyses, I keep talking to slides but not really orienting to them, so I'm going to go back for a second. Often, I'm talking about the slide that's coming, so don't get confused, right? Often, analyses of internet discussions really boil down to what words are people using, and they miss out entirely on, well, where is that person in their journey within the community? Because words get used quite differently depending on where they're at. And so this is a woman who has early stage breast cancer, early stage breast cancer, and she's going to go get a lumpectomy. And she heard about this neoadjuvant therapy from her oncologist, and she didn't really know what to do with it. And two things I want to call out. One is how quickly she becomes really smart and starts giving advice. And the second is how quickly she starts giving advice back to the community, right? So on the left, she gets diagnosed. April 25 is her handle, early breast cancer patient. She says, I've got invasive ductile carcinoma, no other info, or at least none that I could jot down quick enough, haha, right? So basically she's saying, hey, my doctor told me I have this thing. I really don't have enough information. Community of strangers, would you please help inform me as to what my choices are? Okay, next she goes, got ultrasound and biopsy, right? So 6 days later, got the ultrasound, got the biopsy report, said it's probable I'll have to have chemo. I'm not sure if I should do it before or after lumpectomy. Not strong reason either way, maybe just lessen the size before surgery. Again, these are quite short, so you can't see the whole posting, but basically she's asking, do I do neoadjuvant therapy? And what becomes very clear through her discussions back and forth, so she gets welcomed to the thread a few days later. April, welcome. The time of diagnosis is a very scary time, trying to figure things out. So sort of orienting her to where she is. Can't just do this by yourself. You can decide how much help you want, from whom and when. So orienting her to how can you interact with this community? What can you expect from us? What should you expect from yourself? Very, very, very quickly, April 25 realizes two things. Neoadjuvant therapy has no real survival benefit, but it does have a cosmetic benefit, and I don't mean that lightly. It reduces the size of your lumpectomy, which reduces the amount of deformity to your breast, which means that you may not need reconstructive surgery afterwards. So essentially, once April got over her scare of being told she had cancer, and then got over feeling like, well, neoadjuvant therapy was useless because it didn't give a survival benefit, things settled down and she realized, actually, I do care about the aesthetics of this, and I've got an early form of breast cancer, so it's not as life-threatening. So I am going to do this. Apparently my lump is big for a B cup and I might end up looking pretty deformed if I get now notice this, she writes LX, right? That's shorthand for lumpectomy. In 2 weeks, she goes from not knowing what a lumpectomy is to using the correct shorthand within this community for calling it. So this is immediate socialization. And she goes from being a legitimate participant, a peripheral participant, to a core member giving back out advice. And then she's stayed in the community for a while, and I haven't really followed up on it for a while, but this is in the span of 2 weeks. And there's not a lot of communities you can join and become an expert in 2 weeks, but when you're a highly motivated person who's been diagnosed with cancer, that's one of the hallmarks of these communities, is how fast you can become a member. So, so what can we learn from applying anthropological models to online interactions? First, to me, I keep thinking of them as professionalized learning organizations focused on specialized forms of knowledge and experience. Professionalizing patients. In an era when doctors are becoming less relational and more transactional with patients, patients are becoming more professional about their own care. And professional not in the sense of getting paid, but in the sense of getting better at it. What should we call these things? I think they're online healthcare communities of practice. Not all of them. Message boards and forums aren't necessarily. But if you're involved with a small group of people in an ongoing fashion, and you all know each other, and you're greeting each other by name, hey, what was your test like? Hey, how's your kid doing in school? That is a community of practice, right? What can we learn from them? People are people. We organize ourselves the same ways, whether it's online or offline, whether it's around being better at playing baseball or being better at taking care of an elderly parent or spouse. The thing, this last bit is, most anthropologists, myself included, I'm a linguist by training, but it's in the field of anthropology. I don't have the training to sort of do the modeling that I showed you earlier to find these communities. I had to find someone who did have that training, and that was my fellow computational linguist who had a lot of computer skills and almost no anthropological training. So I think one of the things that's interesting, just from a disciplinary standpoint, is we're starting to have to put things together in ways that we haven't had to before to come up with answers. And the reason I call that out is I think that's probably true for patients as well. We're starting to have to figure out alliances on the patient side, on the survivor side, on the caregiver side, with groups that traditionally we didn't work a lot with industry, with payers, that sort of thing. And so it's interesting times. So, in some ways we haven't changed at all as people from when we were living in small communities and had no internet and had no really anything but fire and stones. And in some ways we've evolved massively, in terms of our healthcare capabilities, but we still do the same things. So, I believe that's it. I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to put myself back up online.
Perfect.
I think I went a little long. I apologize.
No, I didn't stop you. I was fascinated by all of this. I think plenty of times you were making these points that someone who works with communities a lot, I was like, oh, well, that's true. Oh, I see that a lot, but I had never made the connection. So that was really fascinating. Great information. We do have a few questions, so I want to get to those because I know we are tight on time. But the first question is, are moderated groups also communities of practice? So moderators or admins, they can discipline members or eject them from the group. So does this really count as a community of practice as well?
I would say yes. I would say that's one of the interesting things, right? So we're applying a model that was designed in an educational setting to think about a very specific set of circumstances, right? Tailors know what tailors should know. Lawyers are the ones who write the bar. So lawyers are definitely professionals, right? Lawyers disbar and bar other lawyers, right? Nobody else is responsible for monitoring lawyers. So one of the questions that's always come to me is the moderator part of the community or not? If they're not part of the community, what sort of norms are they enforcing? Is it, basic human norms of like, don't sexually abuse people online? Okay, that's very fair, but is that the same as having somebody with a spinal cord injury be the moderator of a spinal cord injury group who really sort of like lives it? I don't have an answer to that. It's a really good question. So I think rather than think of it as an exclusionary label like this isn't, think about like how useful is that heuristic? How useful is that label to helping you think about what are we doing together?
Yeah.
And if the moderator is just there to keep people online because the internet is sort of a sewer of anonymity and people are very abusive, then fine, Yeah. I don't think it's one way or the other. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a very good question, and it raises the question, how applicable is something that was developed in one field to another one without any modifications? And the answer is you always have to modify it a little.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a good point. It depends on the situation. So
Yes.
going off the leaders, how do leaders emerge from the primitive group? And don't most health groups have a mayor?
I don't know. I mean, I think I see at least two models. I see two models. This is a little weird talking to myself, I gotta be honest. But one of them is Dr. Oz as an example of somebody who's pretty much like out there, right? And I think of that as the Roman Forum. There's a guy on a pedestal and he's talking and people might shout questions at him. He doesn't know the vast majority of his audience. There might be people he knows, but he's really like one way. That's not a mayor so much as a loudspeaker. He's a human megaphone. Communities online seem to have self-appointed mayors in the sense that people who are super duper duper active become the leaders of communities. So if you're on 24/7, you're probably more influential than the person who comes on once a week. So, but again, many dissertations to be written, not just one, on what exactly is the leader class of these communities. I mean, we just had a hard time finding them, and still trying to figure out what they are. So again, I don't know if that's a great answer, but it's a good question. I guess the question back would be, and I'm happy to engage in a dialogue with anybody on any of these things. What would the mayor's roles and responsibilities be? How would you elect him or her, and how would you remove him or her? All right.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, these are good. Good. Yeah. So definitely every question has more questions at the end of it for this. This is really just, it depends on the situation and natural, like you said, someone interacting daily is going to naturally become a leader more so than, someone who's doing it once a week type of thing. But yes, that's great. And then I'm intrigued to hear this question or this answer, excuse me. So are there any changes in online communities since social media has exploded? Yay!
Okay, again, a couple of things. People seem to be people no matter what or where or how we've, right? Like, so the fact that we've gone to the moon and, can map our own genetic code has not made us any less uncomfortable around the taboos of sex, dying, and, the sort of standard taboos across all cultures. So we're still kind of, in one sense, not really any different from our ancestors. We have exactly the same sets of taboos. We still don't really know why we're here, for example. I'm not trying to get metaphysical, but so what hasn't changed is we seem to be comfortable in groups of around 50 to 100 people, right? Mm-hmm. It's about the size of a baseball team. It's about the size of a football team. It's the size of a platoon. It's the size of a Boy Scout troop. It's the size of an online healthcare community that spontaneously coalesces out of a really large group of people. So my guess is that part's not going to change. What seems to have changed and what I find both fascinating and disturbing is Twitter does seem to have changed the depth of interaction. And so there seems to be a lot more anonymous sort of like flyby stuff. But I don't consider those communities. Again, that's just shouting at strangers on a subway car to me, right? I come into Manhattan fairly often. If I just started insulting random strangers walking down the street, that feels like Twitter. If I just started telling them what I had for breakfast, that feels like Twitter. These are random strangers, right? I'm talking about people who actually get to know each other in a very close way and are committed to solving a mutually held problem. How do I take care of my dad without going crazy because he needs so much and he refuses to accept it? That's a common theme in Alzheimer's. Anybody who's ever been around anybody taking care of somebody in Alzheimer's recognizes that question. That's got nothing to do with the form of the forum you're in. That's just a human connectivity issue. Do we meet at a diner or do we meet online is irrelevant. So
I just saw Janet's disagreeing a bit because of
I see that. Yep.
community hashtags, which I know are huge, and that really does string a lot of communities together. So I totally get there's so many people on Twitter that are just.
You know what? And I'll say that I think that's totally fair. And again, I have a bias against Twitter. It's not my favorite thing. I am readily willing to accept that I am not an expert in Twitter. The thing that I find when I do talk to people about Twitter, and again, please come back to me on this one. It's not that it's not informative. It's that unless you're continually interacting with the same people on Twitter, it's not really a community. I can have a very informed discussion with all of you right now. Well, it's kind of one way, right? But let's imagine it wasn't. If I never have the same discussion with you again, we really haven't formed a community. What we've had is a really great conversation. And that's fine too. I'm not evaluating one higher than another. I'm just saying the only other way I've seen Twitter function as a sort of community glue is when you already have people who know each other quite well and they're using Twitter as a shorthand to communicate to each other. I don't know if you really create lasting relationships only through Twitter. And again, if I'm wrong, I apologize. That's my answer. It's not the right answer. I am not the Twitter guru. So.
Oh, nor am I. But we see a lot of conversations. Like we have the We Go Health chat. I know there's the Spoonie chat. So here, I think is kind of what Janice is talking about. But they've already created that community maybe through their blog or through a Facebook group, and then it transitioned over to Twitter. So
I'm open to that. And I guess Janet, I would ask you. Go back through some of the sort of conversational stuff and say, can you identify community norms? Can you identify some of the things that I said were the hallmarks of these online healthcare communities of practice or just community of practice in general? And if you can, then yes, they're community. I mean, and naming them not communities doesn't devalue them. It's just they're different.
Yeah. Yep.
So.
Yep.
All right. So I see a lot of people coming back saying there's definitely vibrant, self-organized communities on Twitter. I am totally open to that, and I will look further at it. I think
I'll email you our next We Go Health chat. You can join that one. It's the second Tuesday of every month, so everyone can join that, and I'll certainly send you the details. But I do want to say thank you, Brad. This was incredible. I know we're short on time. I just want to make a few announcements. I'm putting a registration link for our meetup. If anyone's in the Pittsburgh area, come hang out with the We Go Health team next week. We're in the Berg, so we'd love to hang out for, we're going to have food and drinks and a panel discussion. So registration link is right in there. Please, if anyone found this webinar useful and would like to share it with their friends, family, or fellow community leaders or members, we will be putting a replay of the blog replay of the webinar up on our blog. We'll send that out next week. You'll see it on our social channels. And I want to thank you all so much for joining us. Oh, Julie's also saying we have our nominations coming in for We Go Health Awards, which is, I know some of you are familiar with it. Stay tuned. We'll be giving you guys more information on that coming soon. But I just want to say thank you, Brad. I think this was a very beneficial webinar for a lot of our patient leaders. I see it as a resource for much of our network. So thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. And again, if I've offended anybody about Twitter, it won't be the first time. So, but I am open to learning more. I promise you.
That's why we have these, is to have discussions amongst the community. No problem at all. Not a problem. Great. Well, thank you so much again. And thank you, everyone. Have a great night. And hopefully we'll either see you at our next meetup or our next We Go Health chat.